Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us in our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. My name is Dejan Kosutic, and I'm the Portfolio Marketing Manager for Information Security and Management at PCB. Today we'll be discussing 7 key problems to avoid in ISO 27001 implementation. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our presenter for today, Mr. Dejan Kosutic, who is the main ISO 27001 expert at Advisera. He has an extensive working experience both as a tutor and as a consultant, and he is an approved tutor for ISMS Lead Auditor courses and delivers various ISO 27001 online courses. Please be reminded that you will have the opportunity to submit written questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the question pane of the control panel. I hope you will have the chance to learn new, valuable things in today's session. Please, Dejan, you may start with your presentation.
Thanks, Ardian, and hello everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. Okay, so basically, just one note about the webinar. If you want to, you can ask me actually a question during my presentation, so you don't have to wait for the Q&A session. But of course, at the end, we will also have the Q&A session, so for the remaining questions. So anyway, in this webinar today, I'll present the most common mistakes companies or people usually make with ISO 27001 implementation. And basically, this webinar today is intended to really for, I would say, beginners with ISO 27001, or let's say generally the people who are beginning to implement their ISO standards for the first time. And in this webinar today, I'm not going to explain the implementation steps. I'll only explain what are the potential problems that can happen that you should be avoiding. So if you're starting your ISO 27001 implementation, then you have to make sure that you really think through all the things that can happen, and actually, or bad things that can happen during your project, and you have to structure this project, let's say, in appropriate way so that you avoid all these mistakes that you could make. And of course, I'll take you through all the mistakes that I see usually are happening. Okay, now. It's funny actually, when I started to prepare for this presentation today, I actually found out that most of these failures in the implementation are very similar, you know, throughout all the companies worldwide, and also throughout actually any industry. So the main point is really that most of these implementations, if they fail because of very similar problems. So the agenda for today are basically, you will see these 7 key problems or 7 key issues that you should be aware of, and they are listed here as you can see them. So the first one is that the implementation steps the problem is that the implementation steps are very often not following the logic of the standard. So I'll explain actually why this is important and what you have to do to avoid any problems. Also a problem, this is especially one that I like, that I see very often, and that it's creating problems without actually need for something like that, is creating or writing too many documents. So I'll show you a couple of examples why you shouldn't be doing this. Also, the third topic will be about creating documents that are not really usable, that are really unusable. Fourth topic will be, or fourth problem will be about who is actually responsible for running the project and problems that happen if this is only one person without anyone's help. Fifth item is the how to view or how to set this project, and actually trying to avoid this notion that this is only an IT project, and really how to make it, let's say, attractive, so to say, for the business side of the organization. Sixth key issue that we'll go through is the if you start using some tools, then what you can expect and what you cannot expect from these tools to do for you. And finally, the seventh issue that I will mention today is, I mean, last but not least, this is about the top management and the problem that you will run into if the top management doesn't really understand what you're doing. Okay, so let's go for the first one. So first, implementation steps are not following the standard. So here are some examples that you definitely need to avoid. For instance, let's say that you start to implement controls without actually doing the risk assessment first. Now, the purpose of the risk assessment is to find out which potential problems can happen, in other words, to identify the risks, and then based on these risks, then you can actually select which controls you need to implement. So if you implement the controls before the risk assessment, this means that you might actually implement some controls that are not really needed, but on the other hand, you actually might miss the controls that are needed. So I mean, this is definitely something that you shouldn't be doing. Also, let's say that you start to do risk assessment before actually you find out what are the legal requirements in your country, because in some countries the local regulations actually require you to do a particular type of risk assessment. So again, you cannot really start, doing the risk assessment before finding out what are the legal requirements. Also, if you start doing or defining the ISMS scope before actually finding out what is the context of your organization. So let's say that you want to limit the scope of your ISMS only for one particular department in your company, but your company, let's say the most sensitive information in your company are actually located in some other departments, and this sensitive information is, let's say, freely available throughout your whole company. And in such a context, it will be really difficult to select only one department which is, let's say, not separated logically or physically from the other departments, and that doesn't actually contain any sensitive information or important information. So you have to find out the context of the organization first. So what is my point here? You shouldn't really start to implement the standard, from the, let's say, point that you like the best. Okay, you start reading the standard, then you find the, let's say, most attractive, I don't know, access control policy, and you start doing this. It doesn't work this way. You have to follow the structure of the main part of the standard. You have these clauses from 4 to 10, and luckily they're written really in the order that you should be implementing the standard. Okay, now let's go to the next, to the second, let's say, most common problem. And as I mentioned, this is unfortunately a very, very common problem. Sometimes I see companies like, that they have, I don't know, 20 employees, and they start writing, 30, 40, 50 documents. And I mean, can you imagine, such a small company having, like 50 new procedures and policies? Of course, these employees are going to start hating this ISO 27001 standard and the security guide. And of course, they're not going to comply with all these policies and procedures because simply this is too much for a small company. So what is important to remember is that writing a document for each control is not mandatory. This is not required by the standard. So just to give you an example, let's say control called A1111 physical security perimeter. It's about defining, where is your, let's say, physical perimeter, so where are the walls and gates and so on. I mean, why would you need a procedure for something like this? Especially if you're a smaller company. I mean, why would you describe where the walls are and where the doors are? It's ridiculous. If you're a larger company, okay, this might make sense. But for a smaller company, not really. So don't really try to write a document for each control, because this will only overwhelm you, and there will be no use in it. A second example of what you should avoid is really write a document for clauses that are not mandatory. So for example, context of the organization, these are the clauses 4.1, this is the clause 4.1, it is not mandatory to write a document for it, okay? So why would you, write the document, why would you write a policy or a procedure for the context of the organization when it's not required, okay? What you have to do is, for instance, write a scope document. This is not mandatory, okay, and you need to have it. But why would you write something that is really not mandatory? Also, many people, when they start writing, all this documentation, then they, figure out that, it would be really nice if we had like a procedure for, I don't know, updating, let's say, antivirus software. And I mean, if this is something that is not required by the standard, if this is something that normally works fine in your company, and it doesn't really need an additional document to improve of what was being done, then why would you write the procedure? Why would you have another document when this is not required and it works fine in the company? I mean, it's already somehow became a normal process for everyone in the company. So why would you need an extra document? So my point is, when you start implementing the standard, your actually aim, especially if you're a smaller company, your aim should be to have a smaller number of documents, not larger number of documents. So the less documents you have, the easier will it be for you to implement the standard and ultimately go for certification. If of course this is the aim to go for a certification. And I mean, as you probably know, ISO 27001 implementation is an ongoing thing. So after you implement the standard, you have to maintain the system. And of course, then you can actually start adding some documents if you feel that they are necessary. But you shouldn't really be doing the opposite. You shouldn't be really writing too many documents and then start reducing them afterwards. It will be much harder. Okay, I have a question from Fabrice. So he's asking, ISO 27001 requires justification for exclusion of controls. No need for a procedure, but still you have to provide a reason for not implementing it, or am I mistaken? You're right. So this is actually the same requirement in 2005 and 2013 version of the standard. So you have to justify why you have excluded some of the 114 controls from the NXA. And basically, you have to state there are no risks, there are no legal requirements, and basically this is why you didn't apply a certain control. Okay, now let's move on to the topic, or let's say problem number 3, is if you start writing the documents that are not really usable. So not only is the problem of too many documents, it's also a problem if you have a document that you simply cannot understand. And unfortunately, I've seen many of such documents. You start writing, you start reading a sentence or a paragraph in this document, and you read it over and over again, and you simply cannot understand what is this about. It's written in a language that you cannot understand, or it's simply logically not connected. So how to avoid these kind of situations, or what to avoid? First of all, you should avoid writing documents that are too lengthy. So, I mean, definitely try to avoid, let's say, like some big information security policy that will include all of your security rules. And then you put in the backup procedures, I don't know, how you allow the access. You include also physical security. You include everything into this document. And you'll end up with a document that is like 80 pages or 50 pages long. Now, who in the world would read such a document? I mean, I'm sorry, but it's not realistic that you expect really anyone to read such lengthy documents. So what you should do is really reduce the size of these documents to something that is manageable. I mean, it's not only difficult to read such a document, it's also difficult to maintain it. Okay, so try to reduce the documents to, let's say, 5 pages at the most. Also, it's a very big problem if you're using some technical language, especially if this procedure is intended for, let's say, business users. So let's say that you have some kind of acceptable use policy which all of your employees in the company needs to comply with, including, let's say, your accounting. And I mean, you cannot really expect the ladies in accounting to understand some, I don't know, tech language which speaks about, I don't know, some program codes and this kind of stuff. It doesn't work. You have to write all of your policies and procedures in a way that, I mean, your children that go, let's say, to elementary school can understand this. I mean, this should be the principle, really. You have to write it in a way that is easy to understand. Okay. The next thing you should avoid is that when you develop, or you should really avoid developing rules that are not manageable, that are not really that you really cannot implement in practice, that are really difficult to perform. So let's say that you define that I don't know, that everybody in the company needs to change every password every month, every 30 days. Now, I mean, isn't it crazy, really, to expect everyone to change all the passwords every 30 days? I mean, unless you're working in like CIA, I don't really see the reason to do something like this. I mean, where there, let's say, risks which would require you to do something like this. So don't, write some rules that are really not enforceable, that are not really needed at all. You really have to make all these things in such a way that that are really I mean that make sense, that are based on real risks, and that actually are easily doable. Okay, now let's see some questions coming in. So Ian is asking, security policy less than 5 pages. Now the concept of ISO 27001 is saying that top-level information security policy only describes how actually the top management should manage its ISMS. So the concept of security policy is not a one document which covers everything. Basically, this is not something that is required in ISO 27001, even it's actually somehow suggested. So if you have, let's say, rules regarding classification of information, then you create a separate policy. Okay. If you have some rules that you want to write about backup, then you actually create a separate backup policy, and so on and so on. So the point is, you don't have to concentrate everything, all the security rules in one document, because this would bring really a lengthy document. Okay, Thomas is asking, how do you square the recommendations for fewer documents with the recommendations of maturity view from the CMMI? ISO and CMMI always seem complementary. Well, I mean, to be honest, I'm not really let's say in depth of CMMI, but I mean CMMI and all these approaches are not really mandatory according to ISO 27001. What you have to do is really update all of your documents, and you cannot really convince me that any kind of a framework which requires the documentation really to be used and implemented, that such a framework requires lengthy and too detailed documents. So I've never seen this, and I really don't believe in this kind of approach. Okay, question from Syed. What strategy should an organization use when it is extending its scope to multiple locations? What options do we have? Well, basically you start with, let's say, a smaller scope. You pick one, or let's say, or a couple of departments, and then expand the scope to other locations in your company. Jai is asking, can you give me one more example on procedure? Well, I mean, procedure can be, from how to handle documents to how to handle the incidents to how to handle internal audits. Okay. Does the auditor require operating procedure? So the standard doesn't require you to write the internal audit procedure, but you can write it if you want to. Okay, good. Now let's move on to the next problem. Okay, the next problem is if only one person is working on a project. So picture this. There is the company is, let's say, developing software. Software development company, and there is a huge, big client, potential client, who is requiring this company to implement ISO 27001. And then, the CEO of this company simply says to its, I don't know, not security, but let's say IT administrator, okay, now this is your job, implement the standard, I don't know, in 3 months. And it's not going to work. This is, the implementation of the standard is not a one-man job. It's not really like a software that you purchase and then you let's say, install it on your computer. It's nothing like this. So what you should really avoid is, let's say, here are some examples of or this project manager or this security manager or coordinator that is doing all the work himself, like for instance, listing all the assets and then assessing the risks. So this is not the job of one person. I mean, the assets should be listed by asset owners. So the people who are in charge of certain assets, they should be listing all the assets. And then the asset owners should be the ones to actually assess the risks, not some security coordinator or manager or CISO. Okay. Deciding which controls should be implemented. This is again not the decision of one person. This is a decision of first of all the risk owners, so basically the persons who are in charge of these risks, but this is also a decision of the top management, because this includes also spending some money. Okay, so you can't really make one person decide all the controls that should be implemented. Deciding also which risks are acceptable. Again, risk owners must decide which risks are acceptable, and very often this top management is making this decision on behalf of risk owners. Writing all the documents. I mean, if you have one person writing all the documents, I mean, do you really expect that everyone else in the company is going to comply with this one-man job? Because, I mean, this one person cannot possibly know exactly all the details of how all the other, let's say, processes in a company are happening. So, you know, this has to be a team effort. So this, let's say, security coordinator can, let's say, write the first draft, but then send this document for review in all the appropriate departments. So this is basically how this writing of all these documents should be done. Then you will get much more accurate documents, but you will get also the commitment from these other departments for these documents, because otherwise these documents would be imposed on them, and then of course no one would take these documents seriously. Also doing all the analysis or measurements. I mean, it's not a job of one person to measure everything in the ISMS. If all these policies and procedures are accepted and let's say if they are implemented throughout the company, then also the reporting about the effectiveness, let's say, of all these controls should be done within these departments. And of course doing the internal audit. Sometimes I see, you know, the people who are, let's say, security managers, and then at the same time these people are the internal audits in their auditors in their companies. No, I mean, this is conflict of interest, obviously. You cannot audit yourself and be objective. So this doesn't work. It cannot be done. I mean, the standard expressly forbids this kind of conflict of interest. So anyway, the point is, when starting to implement the standard, you need to have one person who is going to coordinate the project, to be clear here. But it has to be clear that this is a team effort, so that you know, there are many other people in the company who need to be, let's say, included in this project, and that ultimately these changes and these new processes will have to be done by almost everyone in the company. Okay, now let's go through some other questions that came in. So Ramsey was asking, are there 3 levels of policies documents, global, specific policies, procedures to develop? I mean, you could take this approach, a very typical, let's say, pyramid of documentation is that at the top you have policies, that you have, then below them you have the procedures, and then that you have working instructions that describe the level, the particular things from the procedures, and then that you have records that are produced as part of policies and procedures and the working instructions. But I mean, you don't have to use this kind of, let's say, structured approach for the documentation. You might use it if you're a larger company. Then it's easier to, let's say, orient yourself within the documentation. But if you're a smaller company, don't really think that you have to fit everything into this concept of levels of documentation. Okay, question from Adewale. Can we just have one overarching security policy and have other policies like acceptable use policy described as directives, guidelines, and standards depending on the information contained in them? Well, basically, yes. This is something that I mentioned as a good concept. So basically, you could have one security policy. Typically, as I mentioned, the requirements of ISO 27001 for information security policy is to define the, general objectives, to define how the objectives are made, to define, let's say, that top management is committed to information security, to define who is responsible and so on. And I mean, so the point is that ISO 27001 does not require you to put any specific security rules in this top-level information security policy. I mean, you know, go on and read the standard, and you'll see for yourself what it says there. So again, you don't need a security policy covering all the security rules. This you can do with policies which are focused on certain areas, like okay, acceptable use policy or classification policy, and this top-level policy, in my view, is enough to have only these things that are important for the top management. And really, in my view, this is the most optimal structure of documentation. Okay, Sued is asking, is risk management independent activity or collective effort? It's both. I mean, when it comes to assessing the risks, I mean, assessing or identifying the assets, and then or listing the assets, identifying the risks, and so on, it's typically individual. But when it comes to decisions on whether some risk is acceptable or not, when it comes to a decision about which controls to implement, then this is a team effort. Sophia is asking, with regard to training, how often should information security awareness training be conducted? Every year? I mean, this really depends, but typically you should do the induction training when someone is starting to work in a company, and then you should do the trainings, I would say, more often, because, you know, once a year it's probably too rare. And I think that when it comes to awareness, it's wrong to think only in terms of training. I mean, you can raise awareness by sending some, you know, emails with some examples. You can raise awareness by sending videos from YouTube. You can send awareness by, I don't know, doing some kind of a collective meeting in a company. So it doesn't have to be once a year. I mean, you can do it almost every week or every month. Okay, now I see many questions are coming in, so I'll have to move on with my presentation. Okay, now let's go to the problem number 5, and this is viewing ISO 27001 as implementation as an IT project. Now, of course, that information security implementation heavily depends on IT, and I mean there is no doubt about it. But not whole implementation is IT. There's something like, I mean, when you see the controls from the NXA, about only, I think 48% of them are IT related. The rest of these controls are related to legal practice, to organizational issues, to human resources management, to physical security, and so on. So what does this mean? This means that there are many controls that need to be implemented that are related to non-IT things. Just to give you an example, let's say that you have a laptop in your car, and that your company wants to do something about this risk that your laptop can be stolen from the car. So you can, of course, implement controls like encryption of your disk, I don't know, secure passwords, backup, and so on. But you also need controls like training of people, that the people understand what is this about. You can introduce, of course, some organizational rules, I mean policies, which will basically forbid doing something like this. You can also introduce some legal controls, basically that you say to every employee that he's responsible materially if this laptop gets stolen. So you see, I mean, for let's say very usual risk like this, you can find many non-IT controls. So if you want on a company level this project to be implemented properly, then you definitely need let's say somehow the perception that this is not only about IT. And here are the problems of what you really need to avoid. First of all, you should not set the IT person as a project manager. you should choose someone, let's say, who is security oriented, or you should probably choose someone who is who at least has a lots of business experience, so that people from the business side of the company would listen to what he is saying. Also, what to avoid is to set the ISMS scope for the IT department only, because I mean I've seen this quite often. You know, the people are setting the scope for only for the IT, and then they find out that it is actually very difficult to widen this scope to other departments which are non-IT, because everyone is considering, yeah, this is the IT thing. I mean, why would we need, you know, to be in this ISO 27001 standard? So it's very, very difficult to get rid of this perception of IT if you start as an IT only at the beginning. What you should avoid is also including only IT personnel in the project team. So if you have, let's say, 5 project members, I mean, if you have all the 5, I mean, if all these 5 are IT guys, I mean, then you didn't really get too far. I mean, you should really typically include one person from the IT, and the rest 4 should be from business side of the company. So let's say in, I don't know, if you have some kind of operations or manufacturing, if you have finances, if you have human resources, if you have legal, now these are the guys that you want to see in your project team. Planning the project as part of your IT budget. Now, if you, let's say, have these cycles of planning, and if you put the ISO 27001 as an item in your IT part of the budget, then your top management will, you know, start to think of your implementation from the very beginning as an IT thing. And again, this is something I would say that is not good, because what you want is for your top management really to perceive your IT project, ISO 27001 project as something that has business benefits. And actually, I can actually give you a link to an article which speaks about these benefits of ISO 27001. So just give me a second. Okay. So here's the link to Advisera site, where you have this article about 4 main benefits of ISO 27001 implementation. Okay, what you should also avoid is that Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO, is actually subordinate to the head of IT, because this is basically a conflict of interest, and even in some, let's say, in some industries, in some countries, this is actually not legal. So, for instance, in Europe, in banking industry, CISO has to be separate, completely separate from the IT part of the organization, and typically this CISO is responsible directly to the management board, to the, let's say, CEO of the company. So this is also something that you should be avoiding if you want to see. I mean, if you want that your that implementation of your ISO 27001 is not perceived as an IT project. Okay, now let's see some questions that came in the meantime. I see really lots of questions, so I'm sorry if I won't be able to answer all of them. So Sophia was asking, in a small company, how does the internal auditor remain independent if they're also involved in the project as a whole? So basically, you should, I mean, this the auditor should not be included in the implementation of the standard. And when it comes to auditing the department where internal auditor normally works, then you should employ another second internal auditor, so that the second internal auditor audits the department where this first internal auditor works. So basically, in this way, you have 2 auditors, and you can cover the whole scope of your company with no conflict of interest. Also, a question from Sophia: how many months in advance should the internal auditor be conducted in preparation of the surveillance or certification audit? There is no let's say set rule in the standard itself, but there are some let's say expectations from certification bodies, and these expectations are actually different. Some certification bodies actually require you to do let's say, all these preparations, all this implementation at least 3 months before the certification audit. But this is something, this is different from certification body, from one certification body to another. Renee is asking, we have an internal audit group which audited several security processes last year. Do we have to perform another internal audit once the ISMS implementation is done in order to get the certification? The answer is yes. So you have to audit your ISMS against ISO 27001. If you audited your security process against some other requirements or some other framework previously, this is not then enough. This doesn't cover actually the whole scope of 27001. Okay, Jaya is asking, are all mandatory documentation should be done before risk assessment? Definitely not. There are many documents that have to be done after, for instance, statement of applicability, for instance, risk treatment plan, for instance, acceptable use policy, the access control policy and so on. Fatima is asking, is there a minimum number of policies that the standard requires? Yes, there is a minimum number or mandatory documentation, and I can actually send you a link to this, an article which describes all the mandatory documents. So let me see. Okay, so here's the link to an article which describes all policies, all the mandatory documents according to the standard. Let me take another question before moving on to the next slide. So Sonila is asking, would you create one policy for internal employees and a separate one for external having access to your enterprise information? I mean, this really depends on what this policy would be about. It's really, I mean, it's a different thing if you write about, I don't know, classified information as opposed to if you write, I don't know, a policy about, I don't know, when is your cafe open. So it's really, you know, depends on the topic. Okay, now let's move on to the sixth biggest problem is that actually you're expecting that some kind of a tool will do most of the ISO 27001 implementation for you. And I mean, don't get me wrong. Really, it's I think the tools are useful for the implementation, and you know, but actually the tools cannot replace actually the human work. And I mean, when you want to make some changes in a company, you really cannot expect to you know, download some software or use some kind of a tool actually to do this change for you. I mean, you have to speak to your employees, you have to convince your top management that these kind of changes are needed. So it's not really, I mean, implementation of standard is not like, okay, I'm going to purchase something off the shelf, I'm going to download it, implement it, then you know, you're done. This is really not something that could be done. Anyway, what to avoid is presenting to your top management that investment in a software or tool will resolve the whole implementation. I mean, again, these kind of tools are useful. I mean, after all, I work in a company where we sell, you know, these toolkits and different tools for the implementation. But what I'm trying to explain is that this is not going to, this is useful, but it's not going to resolve the whole project or the whole implementation. Also, what you should do, you should not do, is purchase some expensive or complex tools just for ISO 27001. For instance, I'm seeing sometimes companies purchasing some, you know, really expensive software for, I don't know, asset management, and then they say that they did it because of ISO 27001. I mean, ISO 27001 doesn't, you know, require you to purchase a tool. I mean, you can really, you know, simply list all of your assets in an Excel sheet. So you really don't need anything complex. Of course, if this asset management tool is useful for you because of some other things in your company, then of course, by all means, go for the some specialized tool. But don't, you know, purchase only because of 27001. It doesn't make sense. Okay, what you should also avoid is rely on some checklists of what you have to do instead of simply reading your documentation. Because if you have written your policies and procedures in a clear way, and if these policies and procedures tell you exactly who needs to do what, when, under which circumstances, who makes which kind of decisions, which kind of records you need to produce, then I mean, why would you need a checklist? You just have to read, I mean, your policies and procedures, and there you are. Okay. Also, what you should avoid is that actually you don't understand that implementation is really about changing people behavior. This is basically what I explained already. So the biggest challenge with 27001 is that you have to change some change the way that some things are done in your company in order to increase the security. So for instance, you simply explain that they shouldn't leave the laptops in their cars. Okay, this is a big improvement because this decreases the risk of your laptop being stolen. And I mean, no tool can actually do it for you. This is my point here in this slide. Okay, let me see questions. Son Low is asking, based on your earlier comment regarding documented procedures, I was under the impression for every control as an organization we must show how we are in compliance, and one of the easiest ways to show this is by the way of procedure or policy. I can't think of any other way. Okay, so you're basically saying that it's easier to write, let's say, 100 policies and procedures to prove to be compliant with, I don't know, 100 controls, as opposed to simply having controls that are implemented without actually having certain policies and procedures. And I really disagree with you here, because, you know, certain things are being done, let's say, very naturally, very normally. Okay, I gave you this example of control A1111. I mean, why would you need a procedure or policy which describes where you put the gates or walls? I mean, they're already there. Why would you need a document for it? I mean, if someone wants to be convinced that you really have those walls, then ask him to look around. You don't need the policy or procedure. And you can actually be surprised of how many controls you can actually implement very easily without actually writing a document. Okay. Ramsey is asking, when ISO 27001 talk about processes, it was about security processes like incident management processes, change management processes, or was it about business processes? ISO 27001 basically requires you security activities and processes, but what you have to be careful about is that you have to protect the information, all the information in the scope. And of course, primarily, this is usually the business information that is usually the most sensitive. So you have to somehow integrate these security rules into all of your other processes which deal with this information. So for instance, let me, okay, just think of an example. Let's say that you have a bank, and that this bank has a process of approving loans. Of course, this is a business process. But if this process, if during this process there is a danger that some information might be, let's say, disclosed to unauthorized people, then you have to include some security rules into this business process. Okay. Okay. Jaya is asking, all mandatory documentation should be done before. Okay, I already answered this one. Renee is asking, if a security control was identified in the scope of applicability, does it have to be 100% efficient if we know there's a problem with the process and we already have an action plan to correct the exception so we can get the certification? Okay, there is actually a document called a risk treatment plan where you have to define exactly which controls you plan to implement, who is responsible, and what resources are needed, but also very important are the deadlines. Okay. So let's say that you go for the certification in, let's say, April 2017. And in this risk written plan you say, okay, we'll finish like, I don't know, 90% of your controls before April 2017, but because of some difficulties like you mentioned, we will implement this particular control in, let's say, June 2017, so this would be after your certification. And this is actually acceptable. This is acceptable under three, let's say, conditions. First of all, if you documented this in your risk treatment plan. Second, if the management of your company has accepted the risks that you have because you didn't implement this control yet. Basically, also you may have to, you can actually allow yourself to implement some controls after the certification if this control is not related to some major risk. Okay, so if you actually comply with all these three elements, then you can finish the implementation of some of the controls after the certification. Manuel is asking, what's the most important, IT governance or information security governance? Well, I mean, it's like asking you, do you like better your first son or your second son? I mean, it's it's really difficult to say. I would say that both of these are very important, and it would be bad if actually you would prefer one over the other, because both of them are equally, I would say, important. Okay, let me move on with the next next slide. Yeah, top management, my favorite topic. So, I mean, this is usually the biggest problem. If you start doing, you know, the implementation, and your top management either doesn't know what you're doing, or they know but they don't really understand what you're doing. These are really big problems, and most of the failures of these kind of projects are happening because of something like this. So examples of what you should avoid. You should avoid sending a detailed written proposal on 100 pages, you know, to your top management. I mean, they're not going to read it. I mean, I know because in my company, I'm the CEO. If someone writes me a lengthy email, I delete it. I simply don't want to read it. So I don't have the time for this. And, you know, believe me, your top managers also don't have the time for this. If you want to send them something in writing, it has to be concise, it has to be up to the point, it has to be short so that they can read it in a couple of minutes and understand right away what is it all about. Also, you should not like ask for, I don't know, 2-hour meeting with your top management to present them the project. First of all, you will never get such a meeting. They will never give you 2 hours of their time. Second, I mean, if you're not able to present your main points in the first 5 or 10 minutes of the meeting, then you're not, I'm sorry to say, but you're not up to it. You know, you have to be prepared to be able to really present in 5 or 10 minutes your key things that you're proposing. So I'm sorry to say, but if you want to be, let's say, security manager, you have to work on your sales techniques, and you have to work on your, let's say, presentation techniques, and also on your especially diplomatic techniques. Okay, you should avoid using tech words like firewall or you know, disaster recovery site, because first of all, you know, the business people don't care about this, and even worse than this, if you start using these kind of words, they only see the cost. They only see, okay, now comes the big amount that they'll have to pay for this firewall or disaster recovery, whatever. So don't use these kind of words. What you should really use, and this is what I wanted to emphasize here, you should use the words like profits, revenue, market share, new clients. So try, when speaking about security, try to use these kind of business words. So by implementing ISO 27001, implementing 27001, we will actually decrease the costs because we will prevent some security incidents from happening. Okay. If we implement ISO 27001 and get a certificate, we will get new clients, so our market share will, let's say, rise from, I don't know, 3% to 4%. Okay, so if you use this kind of language, they will start listening to you. And this is exactly the point. If your top management understands why these kind of things are important, why our ISO 27001 project is important, then they will back you up when the things get difficult. And I mean, believe me, you will run into problems with your ISO 27001 project, but if your top management supports you, then they will basically help you when some let's say obstacles need to be removed. Okay, good. Now let's go to conclusions. So, I mean, the conclusion that I can really offer you here is that I think that you will see the biggest benefit of the implementation if you make these rules, I mean policies and procedures for information security as part of your normal day-to-day operations. Or if I want to describe it from another angle, so if you create the documentation only for the certification purpose, so that you want to, let's say, impress your certification auditor and that you want to get a certificate, and then you forget about your documentation, this is, really the worst way to do it, because you will, waste a huge amount of time and really ultimately probably won't get the certificate because the auditors see this kind of situation right away. So it's if you manage to let's say for instance, let's say some kind of procedure for security training, if this really procedure is complied with on almost daily basis, now then you will achieve the maximum effect for your security and of course for your company in total. Okay, so basically this is the conclusion. So Ardian, would you like me to go through the questions that I have now, because we have enough time, let's say, for 15 questions or so?
Yes, Dejan, can you just move to the next slide, please?
Okay.
Thank you once again for delivering this very informative presentation. We want to inform you that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 27001 Introduction, Foundation, Lead Implementer, and Lead Auditor. The training is designed to provide you with the required knowledge to carry out audits of information security management system against ISO 27001 and be able to run the processes involved in implementing ISMS as defined in ISO 27001. A PCB certificate will exemplify your dedication in implementing and managing these processes and frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. Now, because of the time limitation, we will only answer 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll conclude the presentation, and the rest of the questions will be answered by Mr. Dejan when we send him the attendee report. The first question is, if a security control was identified in the scope of applicability, does it have to be 100% efficient if we know there's a problem with the process and we already have an action plan to correct the exception, or can we get the certification?
Actually, I did answer this question. So, I mean, as I explained, the answer lies in the risk treatment plan. So if you want, Ardian, I can read some of the questions and provide the answers to them right away, if this is okay with you.
Okay, that is okay. You can choose the questions and then the rest you can answer them by email. That is just fine.
Sure. Okay, so the question from Sunday, it's better project management office drives all project instead of an IT person, so as to allow maximum participation of key stakeholders and working with timeline and budget. Yeah, I agree with you. If this is a big enough company to have a project management office, of course this is something that you can do. Henry is asking, is it possible for you to share the framework for ISMS? Well, I mean, the framework for ISMS is described in ISO 27001 standard, and this document, the standard itself, you can purchase from the ISO, so iso.org, and you will find there the framework for implementing the standard. I mean, sorry, a framework that describes what is required to achieve if you want to be compliant. Now, I can give you an article which speaks about the steps in the implementation, but I mean, this is, let's say, somehow the help for you to understand what needs to be done. So just give me a second, and I'll find this article. So here it is. Okay, another question from Chikaudi. Can you advise on policy model an organization can adopt while implementing ISO 27001? I mean, there, again, there are different templates or models of the documentation that you can use. And really, depending on various providers, you can find many companies on the internet that are providing these kind of templates, including our company. But I mean, there are different approaches of how they structure, let's say, these documents. So I mean, you can go around and see a couple of companies how they do it. Okay. Also, the question, what is the difference between ISO 27001 and cybersecurity 27032? Well, the difference is between, generally between information security and, let's say, cybersecurity is that cybersecurity focuses primarily on digital information. This cybersecurity standard 27032 is focused especially on this, how to protect the digital information and all the important information with this. And I have to say that this standard, ISO 27032, is not very popular. It's not something that let's say, caught its market. Carlos was asking, do you believe a security committee with internal and external experts is useful in order to the top management could understand and participate about information security issues? Yeah, I think it's useful. I also think it's very expensive. So if a company can afford it, then yes, why not? Okay, yeah, I mean, I can go, Ardian, I can go through a couple of more questions, you know, until, let's say, until the top of the hour. So if this is okay with you.
Yes, that is fine, Dejan. You can go on and answer some questions.
Okay, great. Okay, so Lo is asking, okay, lengthy questions, let me see. Sorry to bring up policies and procedures again. When the auditor asked about A1244 clock synchronization, he requested to see a policy or some form of documentation showing NTP or etc. We ended up reaching out to the server team to have policy created. From your experience, what do the other organizations do to show that they're in compliance? I mean, when it comes to these technical issues, it's important actually what the actual state is. So if the clocks of all the servers in your, let's say, data centers are synchronized, then you have actually proved that you're complying with this control. Now, if everything is right, then why would you need again the policy? So it's not a question of whether you do have or don't have the policy. The question is of the effect. If the effect is that you're fully compliant, then obviously the documentation might not be needed. Let me give you another example. Let's say, let me just think about some very good example. Okay, let's say the example of internal audit itself. Usually companies have the procedures for internal audit, but let's say that the company does not have a procedure for internal audit. But the audits are regularly planned, the auditors are competent, the auditors are performing their job perfectly, they always deliver their reports in time, all the corrective actions are resolved after these reports are being made and so on. So you actually have a process that works perfectly. Now, why would you need to write a procedure if everything works fine? And this procedure is not required by the standard. So, I mean, if everything works fine, if everyone knows what to do, and the results are almost perfect or perfect, then obviously don't need a document. Okay, Eduardo is asking, many thanks. Okay, thank you, Eduardo, for being. Adesina is asking, are we going to share these slides after the presentation? So, Ardian, I'm not sure. Are we going to send these are we going to share these slides with the attendees, or how is it organized?
Yes, the webinar will be recorded and posted on our website, and there will be also the slides of the presentation, so it will be accessible for everyone.
Okay, great. Okay, another question from Fabrice. I understand your point on not stating the obvious, but because of information security continuity control, we also have to evaluate the security controls in disaster recovery situation. It means we have to state that we have first in non-DR situation and then assess the differences. At the end, I still have to mention the type of walls, doors we have in secure areas. What is your point on this? Let me see if I can understand your question here. I'm sorry, I don't really see your point. If you could, actually I'll give you my email address, and if you can send me the question through email, I'll be glad to answer. So here it is. It's dejan@advisera.com. Okay, Lo is asking, is it a requirement to perform internal audit on Annex A controls? Yes, you have to perform the internal audit only on those controls that are found applicable. Syed is asking, does ISO 27001 cover privacy controls? I see a complete different ISO 27018 designed for privacy. What the organization who asks for PII data should opt for? Okay, so ISO 27001 does have some controls related to privacy, but I admit this is not really the main focus. I mean, not that it's not the main focus of the standard, because the main focus of the standard is to protect all type of information, including private information. But the main point of the standard is not about privacy. So you're right. ISO 27018 should gives you a very good overview of privacy controls related to cloud. So if you're using cloud, then you can actually use 27018, and it's actually a very good standard for something like this. So it really depends on what your, let's say, clients are asking for. Are they asking you for some, let's say, standard which protects generally the information in your company, or are they specifically focused on, let's say, protection of PII in the cloud? And depending on that, you can actually you can choose which kind of standard you actually implement. Okay, and the last question today, can you clarify, is it a mistake we excluded network team from our scope, but our scope system connected to network services? So basically it's, I can't really tell you like this, but typically it's, you're asking probably something that is part of the IT department. If your whole IT department is included in the scope and you're excluding actually your network team, I do see problems here, and I would say this could be a really big problem for you. Anyway, I would stop today. So Adrian, thank you anyway. Thank you all for attending this webinar. And Adrian, please take over from here.
Thank you, Dejan, again for this great presentation, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. I would like to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website and our YouTube channel. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey about the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete it and provide us with your feedback. Also, if you are aware of an interesting topic that you would like to discuss and participants would benefit from, please feel free to write down your suggestions. We would like to inform you that next week we will present a webinar about the professional value of ISO 9001 to a person's career. For more information, visit our website www.pcb.com. Thank you all once again, and have a great day.